4 years ago, I went scuba diving for the first time in the crystal clear waters of Key Largo, Florida. I had a clipboard, a pencil, and measuring tape, and I helped map the remains of my first shipwreck. The water was cool against my skin. The silence was absolute. And as I hovered over the remains of the wreck, I felt a sense of coming home. So what do? I follow, dive with, and tell stories about a group of Black scuba divers who are searching and helping to document slave shipwrecks. I started this work because of a chance visit to the Blacksonian. That's what some of us call the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. In that museum, on the second floor, there's an exhibit that features those divers who are all a part of a group called Diving with a Purpose. When I saw that exhibit, and specifically when I saw a picture of the divers, time stopped for me. It was like the clouds parted, the heavens opened, and a spotlight shone on that picture. They looked like superheroes to me. And in that moment, I remembered myself as a 10-year-old kid. I was this little girl from Atlanta, Georgia, raised on collard greens, sweet tea, and the love of my mother. It was just the two of us. My mom was a reading teacher, and I loved books. She used to bring home boxes and boxes of books from her reading conventions for me to read. I remember staying up late at night in bed, under covers with a flashlight, disappearing into other worlds. Fantasy books, adventure books were my favorite, and Madeline Linkle's A Wrinkle in Time was my all-time favorite book back then. I yearned for Mrs. Whatsit to come tap on my window and charge me with helping to save the universe. But I knew that she never would. You see, none of those books that I loved as a kid ever had characters in them that looked like me. Little Black girls were never, ever the heroes in those stories. So when I saw that picture and I understood the revolutionary work these divers were doing, I felt called. Those divers became Mrs. Whatsit for me. I tell you, I heard them whisper an invitation. And so I answered it. I decided to quit my job. I had been working in the nonprofit sector. And the thing is, I'm a storyteller at heart. So I decided to join them and to tell their story. But I soon realized that this was about more than just their story. As I traveled around the world, I found a treasure trove of valuable stories that the world had forgotten. I want to share a few. First, I learned that there were 36,000 voyages that brought 12.5 million Africans to the Americas between the 15th and 19th centuries. 36,000 voyages. Historians estimate that at least 1,000 of those ships wrecked, but to date, less than 20 have been found and properly documented. So there's an enormous amount of history that's just missing. I also found out that 1.8 million Africans died in the crossing from one shore to the other. 1.8 million. Be with that number for a second. We're not talking about the number of people who died on the march to the boats, or the number of people who died once they arrived and were enslaved. We're just talking about the number of people who died in the ocean. 1.8 million souls. Dreamers, scientists, farmers, poets, mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, just gone. The Atlantic Ocean is known as one of the most turbulent oceans on the planet. Some say that's because it's churning with these stories, with these lost souls. Imagine wood and metal, beads and anchors, shackles and bones scattered across the ocean floor, waiting to be reclaimed, waiting to be resurrected. Listen. Who mourns this loss? Who remembers their stories still? Well, I never expected to be one such person. I never thought my work would be about traveling around the world, discovering, remembering, and honoring. I also never thought my work would get personal, that it would take me into my own past. But it did, and that became another story. You see, my mom has this picture of my great-great-grandpa Jack and great-great-grandma Mary on her wall. And they look sharp in that picture. Jack has this neatly trimmed white goatee, and Mary has on a bow tie. A bow tie, y'all. Unfortunately, I don't know that much about Mary, but I do know that Jack was born in 1837 in the area that is now known as Edenton, North Carolina. I also know that Jack was born enslaved to a plantation owner with the last name Roberts. That's all I knew then, all I wanted to know. I just didn't want to think about the pain and suffering that Jack must have experienced as an enslaved person. But this work of diving for slave shipwrecks requires you to face the past. And as I traveled, I started to meet descendants of people who actually came here on those ships. And those descendants knew the stories of their ancestors. And as I listened to their remembrances, I started to feel this longing, this intense, deep longing to know my own family's story. So I hired a genealogist. I thought maybe she could help me trace my roots back to a slave ship too. Turns out she couldn't. Unfortunately, enslaved people weren't counted with identifying details by the U.S. Census before 1870. So most African Americans hit what genealogists call the 1870s brick wall when they attempt to do this research. But my genealogist thought we could dig into Jack's life. So she did, and she found jewels. Turns out Jack managed to amass over 175 acres of land in Edenton. Jack was also chosen as a delegate to the 1865 Freedmen's Convention. That was the first ever statewide assembly of freed Black people to determine their constitutional rights. Jack also fought in the Civil War. He was in the United States Colored Troops, Company B, Regiment 2. And there's evidence that Jack most likely owned a speakeasy. When I heard this information, I felt a stirring of pride for the first time. Jack wasn't perfect, but he finally became real to me. Someone defined not only by his enslavement. And that makes sense, because this work is not about surfacing more stories of Black pain and tragedy. It's about discovery and connecting. It's about remembering and honoring. It's about reckoning and restoring. And ultimately, it's about healing for all of us. Because the transatlantic slave trade is not just Black people's history. It's not even just American history. It's global history. 4 continents, Europe, Africa, South America, North America, and their territories are forever connected and entangled because of those 36,000 voyages across the Atlantic Ocean for 400 years. I heard someone once say that the future is ancestral, that we have to look back in order to understand where we're going. And that's exactly what those divers are doing. That's exactly what I'm doing. We're resurrecting stories from the bottom of the ocean and bringing them back into collective human memory. And we're doing it with pride. We're doing it with power. We're doing it with agency, and we're doing it with love. I am finding that facing the past can be beautiful and transformative, and it can provide a sense of closure. So next month, I'm actually headed to Edenton, North Carolina for a month, and I'm going to do writing and research on Jack's life. And I hope I can find out more about Mary, too. And just a few nights ago, I had a dream about little 10-year-old Tara. We were on a boat in the middle of the ocean in scuba gear, feeling the spray of water hitting our faces. And little Tara leaned over to me, and she whispered in my ear so that I could hear her over the roar of the engine. And she said, "This is only the beginning. We've got way more adventures to go." And she smiled mischievously, and I smiled back and took her hand.